Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here with my May reading wrap-up. I had to skip several Friday Reads updates during the month of May, so there will be books that I'm talking about here today that you haven't heard me talk about before. In May, I read a total of 7 books. Of those, 5 were on audio, which is highly unusual for me to listen to that many audios in a month. 2 of them were also in print, and I was like dual reading them, both in print and on audio, because I had deadlines, and that worked out really well, and I enjoyed that. 2 of the books were ebooks, which is again very unusual for me. I don't normally read many ebooks. I'm usually print and audio. So let's dive in. The first book that I finished reading in May was The Love Scribe by Amy Meyerson. Now, this was one of the featured books and authors at Booktopia, which took place in the first weekend in May. I'll link below to my video summary of Booktopia in case you want to hear more about it. So this is not a book I would have chosen on my own because it's magical realism, which sometimes I like them, many times I don't. It's not really my thing. But the booksellers at Northshire Bookstore in Vermont always choose fabulous selections for Booktopia. So I had faith in them, and I did end up enjoying The Love Scribe. So there's a woman named Alice, and she's kind of at loose ends in her life. She's working as a caterer. She lost her dad, which really affected her. And she's kind of given up on having a serious relationship. Her friend Gabby has not given up on a relationship, but unfortunately, her latest serious live-in boyfriend, they just broke up. And so Gabby is devastated, and Alice wants to help her. Alice and Gabby have a long history since they were young of writing each other letters, and now emails. So Alice sits down to write Gabby a letter on email that she hopes will be comforting to her. And instead, she has this sudden vision of a red hummingbird. And this story kind of plays out in her mind. And she translates it to the page. For the first time ever, she writes a short story about this vision that she had. And she's kind of like just the conduit for this story. It came to her fully formed, and she wrote it down. She sends it to her friend Gabby, and Gabby tells her later that while she was reading Alice's story, sitting in a bar, she met her new boyfriend. The 2 of them fell completely in love. Things are going great. And so Gabby shared Alice's story with her sister and with a couple of friends of hers. And crazily enough, they each fell in love. So little by little, Alice comes to realize that she has this gift, that she writes these stories that makes people fall in love. So with Gabby's support and a little bit of friendly pressure from her friend, Alice kind of leans into this as her new career. She becomes the Love Scribe, and people hire her to write stories for them. Alice has them bound in these beautiful editions, and so that's what this novel is all about. As I said, the magical realism piece of it, didn't love that, but as the story goes on, it gets more emotionally complex, and particularly as things start to go wrong with Alice's gift, the story became much more interesting to me. So that was The Love Scribe by Amy Meyerson. Next up, I had a deadline. While I was still at Booktopia, I started reading The Book of Lost Friends by Lisa Wingate, because my neighborhood book group was meeting the next week to talk about it. This is another one that I used Libby. I got the book out of the library, but I also used Libby to get the audiobook. And on my way home from Booktopia, I was listening to this on audio. And I love doing this. It worked out really well. First, I got to experience these books in both ways, in print and on audio. And the multiple narrators in this book were excellent. I loved this book both ways. This was probably my favorite book of the month. And my book group loved it. We had a great discussion about it. So like Lisa Wingate's previous bestseller, Before We Were Yours, this book it's historical fiction that takes place in two different timelines, 1875 and 1987, but all in the same place, Augustine, Louisiana. So way back in 1875, there's a little girl named Hanny. Hanny and her whole family are slaves on a plantation in Augustine. Because of the Civil War and because the plantation owners have heard that soldiers from the north are coming, they send the slaves all off to a piece of property they own in Texas. So unfortunately, their owner, Mr. Gossett, has entrusted his son to safely bring his slaves, Hanny's whole family, to Texas. Well, his son decides this is a great way to make some money. And so he begins selling people off along the way. So at every stop they make, Hanny loses another family member or two. All of her siblings, her beloved mother, her aunt, and her little cousin, each of them is sold off along this journey. Hanny is the only one in her family who eventually, after the war, makes it back to the plantation. Now, the only blacks left there are Hanny and a few other people. They are now emancipated. They're no longer slaves. They're sharecroppers. But of course, the deal for sharecroppers was horrible. So Hanny is living with some of the other former slaves, still on the plantation property. They're working very hard on their piece of land in hopes that the deal is that after 10 years, they will own it. So Hanny's now 18 years old. She overhears the young miss of the plantation, a young woman about her age, who Hanny, when she was a slave, was assigned to be this girl's companion and to put up with her. But now Hanny overhears her speaking to her half-sister, who is Creole. So her father had a mistress in New Orleans. The father is not doing well and he's traveling. So the two young women, the two half-sisters, set out to find their father's lawyer so they can get a hold of their father's papers and make sure that they each get what they are owed in terms of his inheritance. Now, at the same time, Hanny overhears this and, without them knowing, goes along with them because she's worried about their sharecropping papers and she doesn't want those getting lost or falling into the wrong hands. These three young women are off on this epic journey. They end up going through Texas. And along the way, Hanny discovers something called the Lost Friends column in a church newspaper that is distributed throughout the South. So the book contains, you can see that's the narrative, and at the beginning of each chapter, you get one of these clippings from the Lost Friends column. And this is how former slaves are reuniting with their families. So Hanny loves this idea. She wants to be a part of this so that she can find her family. The other half of this narrative takes place in 1987, when a young woman nicknamed Benny has come to Augustine, Louisiana, in her very first teaching job. She is fresh out of college. She did her student teaching in like a nice suburban, mostly white, wealthy area. And all of a sudden, she is thrust into this small town in Louisiana and her student body, she's an English teacher, her student body is very poor. And they're dealing with all kinds of issues. She sees right from the first day, when one of her students almost faints from hunger, that she can't just teach these kids the way she did in the suburban high school. For starters, they don't have any books, and she's an English teacher. So Benny is dealing with all kinds of issues in 1987. But they're in the same town. The Gossett family is still in that town. They started it with their plantation over 100 years ago. And gradually, these threads between modern day and past history weave together in a wonderful way. I loved this book. Just about everybody in my book group loved it as well. Highly recommend The Book of Lost Friends by Lisa Wingate. Next, once I finished those two audios, my husband and I were traveling to Connecticut for Mother's Day and my mom's birthday. And so on the way, we got to finish the audiobook that we started way back in April when we were on our week-long camping trip. So we finished A Twist of the Knife by Anthony Horowitz. This is one of his Hawthorne and Horowitz mysteries. It's a very unique series where he has put himself, the real-life author, in the center of these fictional stories as a character. I had listened to the first one in the series, The Word is Murder. This is number 4. This was the first one my husband listened to, and we both thoroughly enjoyed it. You can jump in at any point in this series. So the idea is that Anthony, the real-life Anthony, is hired by an ex-detective to write, and he signs a contract to write 3 true crime books about the cases that this detective Hawthorne has solved. And so in the first 3 books, Hawthorne and Horowitz are going around together solving these murders. And it's very much a kind of Sherlock Holmes, Watson vibe. Hawthorne is not really socially adept, but he's brilliant. And Horowitz has written down each of these. The first one, The Word is Murder, has just been published in this fictional world. And it's doing very well. And Hawthorne wants him to sign on for more books. But Horowitz says, no, I'm done. I want to go back to fiction. That's what I do. Meanwhile, Anthony has, he's written a play that is opening up in London. And this really happened in real life. This next part, though, is fictional. On the first day of the play's opening, someone associated with it dies. And all of a sudden, Horowitz finds himself at the center of the police investigation as the number 1 suspect. So he calls on his friend Hawthorne to help him. So they are together again, trying to solve this mystery that this time has very real consequences for Anthony. Wonderful book, wonderful series. If you like mysteries, these are great. And that unique twist just makes them all the more fun. That's A Twist of the Knife by Anthony Horowitz, number 4 in his Hawthorne and Horowitz series. Next up, I finally had a chance to read one of the 3 Ann Tyler novels that I got for Christmas this year. I told my family I liked Ann Tyler, that I had only read a few of her novels, and so they delivered, and I got 3 of them for Christmas. I started with Ladder of Years by Ann Tyler. So at the start of this novel, we have 40-year-old Delia, who lives in Baltimore with her family. Many of Ann Tyler's books take place in Baltimore. And Delia is the mother of 3 almost grown children. The youngest is, I think, a junior or senior in high school. The oldest is just about to finish college. Her husband is a doctor, and his office is in their home because he took the practice over from Delia's father. So they are living in Delia's childhood home. She has lived here her entire life. She went from acting as receptionist and secretary to her father to doing the same for her husband. Her sister lives in the house with them. Her life has been very sheltered. And when Delia's family takes their annual week-long beach vacation to Delaware, I love the appearance of Delaware in a novel because it doesn't happen very often. Delia one afternoon takes a walk down the beach and just keeps going. She leaves. She leaves her family with no forethought, with no premeditation. All she's got, she's wearing beach clothes, she's got a beach bag. She leaves. She ends up in a small town in Maryland, and for a while her family has no idea what's happened to her. Delia goes about just starting over, doing what she's never had a chance to do, find out who she is personally without her family around her. She gets a job, she finds a room for rent in a boarding house, and she just establishes herself in this small town. So that's the setup here. It's a very interesting book, and I do love Ann Tyler's writing. I have to say this wasn't my favorite, and I think it's because I'm the mother of adult children. And, the thought of walking away from them, particularly while they're in high school and college, I had trouble with that. Now I'll just say there's a happy ending and Delia finds her way and, things work out, but it's the children that I had trouble with. But overall, I did enjoy the book. It's a wonderful story. I'm just taking a look. I marked a whole bunch of pages with quotes that I want to write down. So, it did have a lot of interesting, thoughtful passages. So that's The Ladder of Years by Ann Tyler. Next up on audio, I listened to The 57 Bus by Dashka Slater. I have been wanting to read this book ever since it was released, which was a few years ago. Sorry, I didn't write down the release date. It's nonfiction, which I didn't realize when I started, but that just made it all the more engrossing and fascinating. It's about two kids in Oakland, California, whose paths cross in a horrific way. One is a transgender teen, and one day they're riding the bus back from school. They had a habit of dressing very uniquely. They were wearing like a bow tie and a vest, but with a pretty skirt. And a boy on the bus, about the same age, another teenager, is just messing around with a lighter and impulsively, without thinking about it, holds the lighter to the dress. It was like the stuff that ballerina dresses are made of. And unfortunately, the skirt goes up in flame, and the transgender teen is badly injured and spends months in the hospital. Meanwhile, the boy who did it starts his path through the judicial system. But what the author does, that act, the central act of the book, doesn't actually happen until, I don't know, I was listening on audio, but probably about halfway. And in the beginning, you're getting background on everyone involved. Those two teens who are at the center of the story, but also some of their friends. You're seeing their development from children to teens, what they're all about. You really get to know these characters. And so you really have equal empathy for both of them and for what happens to both of them. It is a fascinating, engrossing, unfortunately true story. It delves into issues of race and class and gender, of the shortcomings of our judicial system. It's just a very powerful story. This was another favorite from this month, and I highly recommend everyone read or listen to it. The 57 Bus by Dashka Slater. The Book Cougars podcast, which is done by a couple of friends of mine, Chris and Emily. They were reading one of their read-along books, The Reading List, by Sarah Nisha Adams. So all of their read-alongs this year are focused on books about books. As you can tell, this is a good fit for that. And it turned out to be just what I needed during this very difficult time. It's a beautiful, gentle story. It does have plenty of emotional complexity to it, which I was glad to see. But it's all about the power of books and reading to connect people. So it starts with a teenager named Alicia. She's working at the local library. They live in Wembley in London, or outside of London. She's working in the local library for the summer. She and her older brother are full-time taking care of her mother, who her issues are never really named, but she definitely has some very severe mental health issues. And she doesn't leave the house. And so she and her brother take turns caring for their mother. One of them is in the house at all times. So he's mostly working nights in a warehouse. She's working days at the library. And Alicia's not a reader at the beginning of this book, but her brother suggested the library job to her because at her age, it was one of his favorite places. And to him, it was always a sanctuary. And he's hoping Alicia will find that too. So on her first day, an elderly man comes up to her. His name is Mukesh, and he is recently widowed. Well, I think maybe it's been a while, maybe even a full year now. But Mukesh he doesn't know what to do without his wife, Naina. And his wife was an avid reader. And his granddaughter, who he'd really like to connect with, is also an avid reader. And, you know, his wife had that connection with their granddaughter, and he doesn't. And though he has not left the house much in the last year or done anything socially, he finds a library book of his wife's under the bed. She was a huge fan of this library. She came there all the time. And she always had a stack of library books on her nightstand. Mukesh kind of feels like it's his wife speaking out to him that he needs to get out of the house and return this library book. Before he returns it, he ends up reading it, and it's the time traveler's wife. So this happens right in the beginning of the book. That happens to be among my top 10 books of all time. I love The Time Traveler's Wife. I've read it twice, but I sobbed my eyes out both times and also laughed out loud. It's funny. It's about love. It's like the most beautiful love story. And so Mukesh reads it and is completely drawn into this story and sees parallels with his life and his loss, and then he goes to the library to return the book. So he'd like to read more and kind of honor his wife in this way, but he doesn't know where to start. Alicia's on duty that day, and he asks her for a recommendation. Alicia doesn't read. She has no idea what to recommend, but she has just found a list of books tucked inside a book in the library. And the first book on this reading list is To Kill a Mockingbird. The list is a mix of classics, modern classics, and even more modern books like The Life of Pi. And so, knowing nothing about books, she just recommends to Mukesh the first book on the list, To Kill a Mockingbird. And he's hugely grateful to her. He takes it home to read it. And she knows he's going to come back and want to talk about it. So she sits down to read it too. And that is the start of this story. This story does include some tragic loss, which we were experiencing as well at the time that I read this. But it's a beautiful, beautiful story about the power of books to bring people together, not just those two people, but multiple people throughout the novel. I loved it. It's a wonderful novel. That's The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams. Definitely recommend that. And the Book Cougars will be doing their podcast about it, I think next week. So check out the Book Cougars podcast. I'll link to it down below. Finally, my last book of May was an audio book called Into White by Randy Pink. Now, this is a YA novel. There's a teenager in Montgomery, Alabama named LaToya. And she comes from a black family, but she and her brother Alex are among the only black kids in their school. There are a few others, but not many. Their dad moved them to a really nice neighborhood so that they could go to this school, but they really feel kind of left out. And LaToya just wants, like many of us in high school, just wants to be popular, just wants to fit in. She faces discrimination not only by the white students, but by the black students because they're trying to fit in as well. And one night she wishes to wake up with anything but black skin. And Jesus answers her prayer, and she wakes up white with blonde hair, blue eyes. So, and it's all about her life as this transformed white girl. So, you know, it's kind of a silly premise, and I struggled with that at first. But once I got a little further into the novel, it digs deep into these issues of race and class and discrimination, of belonging. It's actually, I ended up really liking it. And it's definitely got more depth than I thought at first. So that's Into White by Randy Pink. So that was my reading in May. I would love to hear what you read last month. What were your favorite books of the month? Let me know in the comments down below.